Hi, welcome to another edition of Video from the Bill. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, and this is a lecture for public administration, Government 241, and we are now at organization, and I'd like to talk to organization about you today. You find that as we consider the concept of organization, as you look at your PowerPoints that I've sent to you, you find that there are only 5 types of organizations that humans have ever been able to develop. Let's take a look at those 5 types. We find that regardless of what organization you're talking about, I can probably place it within one of these 5 types. First, we have them listed on your PowerPoint. They are the leader-follower cluster, the mosaic, the pyramid, the conglomerate, and organic. I usually use the blackboard, and I put up some very primitive pictures to illustrate them. I've tried to put them down on a piece of paper, and I've tried to use a pen to replicate what I would ordinarily put on the board. Let me show this to you. First of all, the leader-follower cluster is simply what one finds in many traditional societies. The leader-follower cluster, you have a very important, flamboyant individual, an individual that may be able to predominate over all others due to their personality, or perhaps it's a traditional arrangement or a societal arrangement or an economic arrangement that allows them to be the leader of a group of people. But this is a type of organization that you find in tribes and in traditional societies. The second organization, the Mosaic, the Mosaic, that particular organization, those little blocks are supposed to represent separate organizations that are connected to cooperate with one another for the coordination of one, some, or all activities. That tells you it's what? A mosaic is a confederation. It's a confederation. Then we have a pyramid. Of course, a pyramid is self-descriptive, and it consists of successive layers of superiors and subordinates, superiors and subordinates. Then you have a conglomerate. A conglomerate could be best illustrated by essentially, you take the geometric form there that I have there for you, and you divide it into pyramids. And the pyramids are all joined in the center. An example of a conglomerate would be Hershey Foods. Hershey Foods is comprised of a whole series of separate pyramids. The Hershey Chocolate Company being the largest, but you also have Reese's Peanut Butter Company, you have York Peppermint Patty, you have Peter and Paul Chocolate, you have Corey Manufacturing that manufactures all the institutional kitchen equipment. These are just some of the examples of the different pyramids that are joined in the center by the Hershey Foods Corporation, and that constitutes a conglomerate. Lastly, at the bottom of the page is an organic organization. Organic organizations are used very frequently by, for example, NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Administration, and by the military. You find that organic organizations are very flat. You find there's normally a team leader, but they're extraordinarily flat, and they're created to accomplish one thing. And when that one thing is accomplished, they tend to be dissolved. So those are the types of organization that we have at present: the leader-follower cluster, the mosaic, the pyramid, the conglomerate, and organic organizations. Okay? Going on to take a look at bureaucracy. The pyramid organization is the one that's most frequently found in our society, and the one with which we are most familiar. You should understand that a bureaucracy does not simply refer to any government organization. It refers to any pyramid-shaped organization, whether it be in the private sector or the public sector. It's not just a public sector phenomena. The father of bureaucracy is none other than Max Weber. We've talked about Max Weber before. He is the father of bureaucracy. Remember, he's the German historian sociologist who did his work between 1864 and 1920. And there's a picture of him for you again in the PowerPoints up in the upper right-hand side of the slide. You find that Max Weber talks about stages in the development of bureaucracy in the Western world. You find, of course, when the Roman Empire falls in the West in 476 AD, find we enter the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and at this point you have nothing through Central Europe and Western Europe but different warlords, different tribes, all vying for power and slowly seeking greater territory and greater power. Well, Max Weber said that bureaucracy arises during the Middle Ages in the West because the various rulers needed to devise ways, rational administrative techniques, in a way to extend their authority. How could they extend their authority to a larger territory? You find that bureaucracies grow in the Middle Ages because things needed to be done. You find that children needed to be educated, prisoners needed to be housed, roads needed to be built, bridges needed to be built, so wars needed to be fought. And for these purposes, you have the development of bureaucracies. There are other important things that occur to facilitate the development of bureaucracy. That would be a moneyed economy, that we're going to use a nationally recognized currency instead of a barter arrangement for our economy. Instead of me trading a pair of boots for your bushel of wheat, now we will use a governmental money, government recognized currency for such a transaction. We have the moneyed economy, we have the growth of education, and we have the growth of science and rationality. All these things help facilitate the development of bureaucracy in the West. Well, Weber is most known, is best known, and very famous for the 6 characteristics that he points out that define a bureaucracy. What are the 6 characteristics that are necessary to have a bureaucracy? Well, they consist of, number 1, specialization of labor. Number 2, the presence of hierarchy, one group over the other. And hierarchy is used for a number of things. Hierarchy is used to determine how much pay do we have, what is our level of remuneration, how much authority do we have, what are our privileges, and lastly, who's going to be the next promoted? How far up the pyramid are you? So hierarchy is important as the basis for compensation, for authority, for privileges, and for promotion. Find another feature of bureaucracy should be impersonality, that a bureaucracy should treat everyone the same who it has to deal with. Number 4, bureaucracy needs to observe a system of rules, how it works in different situations. Number 5, that every bureaucracy has to have standard operating procedures for how they go about doing their day-to-day jobs. And number 6, you find that every bureaucracy has to have promotion and hiring. Hiring and promotion that should be based on technical competence, not on who you know. Okay? Well, this leads us to the development of America's bureaucracy. Of course, you find that when our founding fathers write America's Constitution, in 1787. They failed to revise the Articles of Confederation, and they write this new Constitution that utilizes a federation concept instead of a confederation concept. Our first president, George Washington, was faced with the task of how does one operationalize the Constitution. Well, in order to operationalize it, Washington establishes a bureaucracy. And it's the beginning of our country. He believes that he needs 4 bureaucracies to get the country off the ground. First of all, we need a Department of War. The Department of War is necessary to defend our shores. We need a Department of State, and we need a Department of State, so hopefully the Army isn't necessary. We don't need to use the armed forces to defend ourselves, that we can have harmonious relationships with other countries through the Department of State's dealings. Number 3, we need a Department of the Treasury to establish and handle a currency. Number 4, we need an Attorney General, which of course is a precursor for the Department of Justice. We need an Attorney General. And then over the next 2 years, George Washington is badgered by Benjamin Franklin to establish a post office, and eventually he does indeed do just that. So that's the beginning of the development of America's bureaucracy. Now, what does Washington create? Washington is, again, such a surprise to his fellow countrymen, and what a great example for the ages. Washington establishes government of the good, or government of the gentleman. Instead of hiring individuals for the government who were political allies of his, who had helped him become elected, what Washington always did was he decided to hire the people who were the best educated, the people who had read the classics, the people who knew several languages, the people who knew how to do geometry and calculus. These are the people that he chose to come into his government. So he created government of the good, or government of the gentleman, and he hired the individuals who were the most qualified, the most classically educated. Well, of course, George Washington belongs to neither political party. He's not a Federalist, and he's not a Democratic Republican. Although, as we all know, in his heart of hearts, Washington is a Federalist because his primary aide and his speechwriter, Alexander Hamilton, is indeed the founder of the Federalist Party. So you find that Washington, for that reason, certainly one of the most important reasons, is probably at heart a Federalist. But Washington ignores political labels, and he went ahead with his government of the good. Well, following him into the presidency was John Adams, his vice president, who was another Federalist. Was John Adams going to discard, throw away Washington's example, and hire all Federalists for the jobs in Washington, D.C., first in Philadelphia and then in Washington? Well, we find no. He continues Washington's example. He continues Washington's practice, and John Adams continues to conduct a government of the good, a government of the gentleman. Well, in 1800, you find that Thomas Jefferson is finally elected to assume the presidency, and now we have the first transfer of power from one political party to the other on a national scale. Now we have the Federalists leaving office and Democratic Republicans coming into office. Was Jefferson going to fire all the Federalists and bring into office all Democratic Republicans? Well, he does release a handful, but he really continues the same system which George Washington established. Government of the good, or government of the gentleman. So government of the gentleman continues through Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. They're all hiring the people that seem to have the best education for government jobs. Now, this hiring practice continues all through the Democratic Republican tenure in the presidency. So 2 terms of Jefferson, 2 terms of Madison, 2 terms of Monroe, and 1 term of John Quincy Adams. Finally, In 1829, after Andrew Jackson is inaugurated to the presidency, he, of course, is not a Democratic Republican. He is now a Democrat. And Andrew Jackson, in his presidential campaign of 1828, he promises everyone that he's going to fire everyone in Washington if he's elected, and he's going to bring in his own supporters. He's going to fill the cabinet, fill the government, the federal government, the national government with Democrats and get rid of those Democrat, Republicans, and Federalists. However, after he is elected, surprisingly, he only fires 20%. He fires 1/5 of the federal workforce, replaces them with Democrats. But you find that now government of the good, government of the gentleman, is no more. Government of the good is discarded, and in its place we have a spoils system. To the victor belong the spoils, and what Andrew Jackson wants to do is hire fellow Democrats for the jobs in Washington, D.C. Furthermore, Andrew Jackson believed that any average person could do government work. Did you ever hear that slogan, that little phrase that some tradesman or workman might say at some point? It's close enough or good enough for government work. That is directly attributable to Andrew Jackson when he's saying that I don't need to have a government of the good or government of the gentleman, because government work is such that any person of average intelligence would be able to do it. And so we have the discarding of government of the good and the spoils system coming into place in Washington, D.C. Now, the spoils system continues all the way until the assassination of President Garfield. President James Garfield is assassinated shortly after he's elected to the presidency, and he's assassinated in 1881 in Buffalo, New York. Find that, I'm wrong. He is assassinated in Washington, D.C. President Garfield is shot in Washington, D.C. at the train station by one of his own supporters. It was a supporter that he didn't have a job for. The spoils system would seem to be a blessing for every presidential administration. Well, they were able to hire some of their most gifted and some of their most prized staff. However, for every one person that they could hire, they probably had to turn away 5 people. Many of those people were bitterly disappointed when they couldn't be hired. That was certainly the case with the assassin of President Garfield. Well, the public was outraged, the press was outraged, and in 1883, we have the adoption of the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act destroys the spoils system, we discard the spoils system, and we replace it with a merit system. We are now going to try to hire individuals for national government, federal government employment based on their qualifications. And this system would be headed by an organization called the United States Civil Service Commission. The United States Civil Service Commission ran the civil service, the body of federal employees that were hired to work in the federal government. You find that this system continued all the way until 1979. In 1979, one of President Carter's notable accomplishments, he abolishes the United States Civil Service Commission. We still have a civil service, but it's no longer headed by a civil service commission. Now we have the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, we have the Office of Personnel Management, and we have the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board. So we have OPM and we have MSPB. Office of Personnel Management is now where you go if you'd like a national or a federal government job. That's where you go to apply, and they are the organization that hires and fires for the president. The Merit System Protection Board tries to insulate federal employees from political pressures. You find that the system had to be changed because while the Civil Service Commission was still in operation, it was felt that there was a dualistic nature to its mission, a mission that was at cross purposes with itself. On one hand, you have the Civil Service Commission that is supposed to protect civil servants from political pressure, and on the other hand, they're supposed to whisper in the ear of the president and any administration. They're supposed to tell each president how they can get more out of each organization. So, in order to separate those two functions, we have the rise of the Office of Personnel Management and the Merit Systems Protection Board. But when we look at organizations, we have to look at ways to organize any organization. And you find that generally there are 4 ways to organize any bureaucracy. What are the 4 ways? Well, the first way to organize any bureaucracy is by place or geographic area. For example, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Here's an organization, of course, that was part of the New Deal. It's founded only to deal with flooding and deal with the river systems of the Tennessee River Valley. So that is by place or geographic area. Second way we can organize any organization is by clientele. A good example would be the Veterans Administration. The VA is established to cater to the medical needs of individuals who have served in the armed services. Another example would be the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is set up in the U.S. Department of Interior specifically to oversee the running, if you will, of our First Nations, of our Indian reservations, clientele. The third way that we can organize put together an organization is by process. This is the way that the Soviet armed forces were put together. Processes we're going to, I'm sorry, I'm wrong, that's objectives, sorry. Process, what I'm after here, process, the best way to illustrate process would be the Hershey Chocolate Factory. When you look at the Hershey Chocolate Factory, you bring the milk in to an area, and that area is called condensing. And all the machinery and all the equipment and all the personnel are set up for one thing, to condense that milk and put it into the productive process. Next you have longitude. Longitude is when you're mixing the chocolate. The chocolate's been made and you're mixing it and making sure that it's of appropriate consistency before it's poured. So longitude. Another section is steel rolls, where once the chocolate is ready to be poured, it's run through steel rolls to filter, make sure that all foreign objects are filtered out and the chocolate is super clean and it's thin and it's very pliable. And it's run through these steel roll machines. So that's another part of the organization. You have shipping, another part of the organization. Each part of Hershey Chocolate has a different process, and all together they put together the chocolate. Lastly, objectives. This is a organizational type that perhaps could best be portrayed by, for example, the former Soviet military. Each part of the military was set up specifically to achieve an objective in the case of war. One was missiles. Another one, of course, would be the infantry, and that would be one invades China, the People's Republic of China, the other part of it invades Western Europe. Objectives. Lastly, we have some concepts in organization that I want you to be familiar with, if you could please. One is span of control. Span of control is simply referring to how many individuals can a supervisor guide. how many people can a boss oversee? And there is a rule of thumb in the federal service, and the rule of thumb is 20. And I think that's about right, because at the state capitol, I went from a staff of 5 policy analysts to a staff of 20 policy analysts. And that was about all I was able to oversee. I had my hands full with 20 policy analysts, 3 secretaries, and 3 interns. That was more than enough to oversee. So, span of control is how many people can you oversee. Now, what's interesting about span of control is if the supervised individuals work with one another, you'll probably be able to oversee fewer than 20, because when individuals work with one another, there are inevitably disagreements, there are inevitably questions that arise, friction that arises, problems coordinating their work. And who has to step in and oversee that and untangle that is their supervisor. So your span of control might be less if you have to supervise lots of individuals who work together. Lastly, I'd like you to be familiar with the concepts of line and staff. Line and staff. You find that line positions are all positions that enforce command authority. They are individuals who do the job of the organization. Staff positions are positions that provide advisory services to the line. Staff positions are your lawyers, your accountants. It might be in the U.S. military, intelligence. It might be people involved with public relations or procurement. These would be considered to be staff positions. We find that the staff is set up to try to minimize the workload of the line, to try to make their jobs easier. But what happens, and has been happening in the modern world, is that staff size keeps on increasing. It keeps on getting larger and larger vis-a-vis the line. And in many instances, the staff is generating additional work for the line. Instead of reducing their work, they're increasing their workload. Many new staff people are entrepreneurial in today's world, and so instead of looking for ways to reduce their boss's workload, they end up finding new things that they might be able to engage in and do. Line and staff is important to understand because where positions are located in an organizational chart and an understanding of that can be essential to avoid conflict. Well, let's stop here for a moment.
Stop.